A friend said to me the other day, Doc, I don't know about this gentle parenting thing. I mean, I'm trying, but what do you do when your child is not gentle childing? And trust and believe, I've been there. So today's episode is going to take a deeper look at ACEs, adverse childhood events, and how we can better parent traumatized children. Stay tuned. Hey, creators. Welcome to Minding Your Amygdala, the brain, body, and behavior podcast where you'll learn to awaken to your emotions, get informed about your biology, and motivated to use skills to improve your mental health. I'm your host, Dr. Lana, America's one and only trauma psychiatrist. Do you recognize the critical importance of emotions and mental health? Do you want to know more about how to self-recover from trauma? Do you want to better understand the updated science about how our brain and body shapes our behaviors? If you answered yes to any of these questions, then you're in the right place. This podcast is focused on making complex brain science simple and usable. You'll learn the 6 primitive brain systems predictably programmed by trauma and empathy skills practice, my unique methodology that can help you improve your own thoughts, emotions, and actions. I'm the Skills Over Pills doc, but I'm also a mom of 3, a busy entrepreneur, and a human being trying to make it through multiple global pandemics just like you. Minding Your Amygdala will teach you transformative ways that you can approach your day-to-day life, and I'll give you strategies to break free from the trauma cycle. All right, let's get started. Y'all, this episode is for the parents. This episode is for those of us who are responsible for the rearing of the children. Gather round, gather round. Now look, I use salty language, y'all, so be mindful that I'm going to say things that the children themselves may not need to hear, but that certainly apply to the children. So please use your discretion. Today's episode is about adverse childhood events and understanding ACEs as they relate to psychological trauma and what we can do about it. Now, I want to be clear that I'm going to talk about ACEs from the context of the general scientific approach. A lot of this information that I'm going to start with is available on the CDC's website if you're interested, and I'll also put a link in the show notes. But I'm also going to go into ACEs from the perspective of a trauma psychiatrist and how I look at ACEs, and I'm going to address tantrums. I'm going to address what we do when our kids are in trouble. And then we're going to talk about trust issues in this episode. So when I think about adverse childhood events, I have to conceptualize this as something that has become more and more prominent in the mental health field only in the past maybe 10 to 15 years. Prior to the most recent decade, psychological trauma has been considered a subsect of mental health conditions, as if some people have what we call trauma. Now, if you've been listening long enough to my podcast, you know that I say all humans have trauma. 100% of us have trauma. However, this information is gleaned from surveys, and surveys have biases. Surveys have limitations. Surveys also are coming from the perspective, not only from the perspective of the investigators, the researchers, but also the sampling of audience or information that even submits information to surveys has limitations in their understanding and awareness. So, when we're talking about ACEs, I want us to not think of it as something that happens to some kids. We can think of it as something that happens to all kids. Because at this point, I think the pandemic has made clear that we have a shared trauma of the entire world having to do a very abrupt, unhealthy, uncertain shift, and because of the effects of COVID-19. And now we are far enough removed from the beginning of this event, which is, by the way, not over. So please continue to take your precautions. It has created a space where we now have data that says that our children are struggling. The children's hospitals and the other mental health mechanisms are putting out data that says that reports of parents bringing their children in for suicidal outburst, for uncontrollable behavior, for addictions and other behaviors that they feel are unmanageable has skyrocketed. And that makes sense because our children have also gone through the trauma of COVID. And just like the adults have had difficulties, the children also sustained these same experiences, had these same unhealthy shifts in their experience, and they also don't have the words to explain it and express it because, as I have mentioned many times, humans are emotionally incompetent. The adults are emotionally incompetent because we have not had enough education and exercise with thinking about, talking about, expressing, and controlling our emotions. So, certainly, the children suffer with this similar disability that is compounded by their little underdeveloped brains. Now, the CDC says that ACEs are common. About 61% of adults surveyed across 25 states reported having experienced at least one type of ACE before age 18, and nearly 1 in 6 reported they'd experienced 4 or more types of ACEs. That could be number 1, experiencing violence, abuse, or neglect; 2, witnessing violence in the home or community; 3, having a family member attempt or die by suicide. And it also notes that there can be other aspects of the child's environment that undermine their sense of safety, such as growing up in a household with substance use problems in the family, mental health problems, instability due to parental separation, or household members being incarcerated or otherwise unavailable to raise that child. And if you think about the state of the United States of America, really the state of the globe, there are many, many, many people who fit that description. Because it's not always just about a parent being removed because of something extreme like incarceration. It can be because of work reasons. It can be because of family dynamic reasons. There are many things that are traumatizing to children. And it's interesting that even as we look at it and we say, okay, let's say that 61% of people do actually only experience this, is hypothetical. It talks about how much these things are linked to actual physical health problems. They believe that by addressing ACEs, we could possibly prevent up to 1.9 million heart disease cases because it stresses people out to have high blood pressure and roller coasters in their environment. 21 million depression cases could potentially be avoided. And children who are at risk are people who, for example, have special needs or disabilities, mental health issues, children who are not closely connected to their parents or relatives or can't talk to them about their feelings, youth who are dating early or engaged in sexual activity long before their brain is developed, children that have few friends or have aggressive or delinquent behavior. The list goes on and on. Children with low income, families with adults with lower levels of education. Uh, Thinking about what this means as we think through all of the components that people are experiencing, I would venture to say that even in households across the class, across the economic spectrum, across the race spectrum, that we are not experiencing healthy dynamics within homes. Many people are experiencing ACEs on a regular basis. Now, I know me personally, I have dealt with this in my home and my family because not only am I a child who's a product of many ACEs, I could list them here, but we don't have time. As a parent, I've also parented through this pandemic. And in addition to that, in my family, I experienced my son going through a very traumatic burn of his face, even just prior to the pandemic arriving. So, number one, I speak about these experiences not only from the space of a trauma psychiatrist, but also from the space of being a parent who is parenting children across the age spectrum, because I do have also a young adult and a younger child across the spectrum, to explain why these terrible T's happen, these tantrums, this trouble, these trust issues, why they occur. And so, starting with tantrums, I think it's important for us to conceptualize what a tantrum actually is. And a tantrum is really about that little body being unable to process everything that it's feeling. And so when babies don't have words, they cry, right? And it's up to the parents to try to figure out what is going on with the baby. And then hopefully, as the child ages, they are able to better communicate and use words to express what they need or what they're feeling, and or get to the point where they can problem solve for themselves and address it without throwing the tantrum when they have intense feelings. Now, hypothetically, we think that we grow out of tantrums, but I'm here to tell you that we don't. Grown-ups throw tantrums. It just looks a little different. We may not roll around and fall on the floor. However, many people describe tantrums when they're describing their amygdala or their body and brain being very triggered about something, and they are feeling big emotions, right? If you've been following in the podcast, the main concept here is that we have to tie what's happening biologically to what we are seeing experientially in other people. The symptoms that we describe for these quote mental health diagnoses are the product of what our brain is doing and how our body is interpreting what's happening around us. So we know that this brain is composed of many different components. The back of the brain, in the back of your head, in the occipital region, is responsible for processing visual input, what you see. The sides of your brain, they have lots of function, but much of it is about processing information from your ears in your auditory areas to understand and communicate with the rest of your body about how you feel about those things, and then expressing words back. So again, we know the brain is complex, but there is an area at the front of your brain called the prefrontal cortex. It is the most evolved part of our brain. Tap it, wake it up. Good morning, prefrontal cortex. Yeah, I would like to talk to your prefrontal cortex. because you, who I'm talking to, has the prefrontal cortex that has to kick on and become the prefrontal cortex for that child that you want to help. And I will explain what that means. One of the things that's important to understand is biologically, when humans are operating, our baseline is primitive. And so, especially in a child, the experience that is happening inside of their body is magnify what happens in yours by like 30. Like their experience is bigger because their brain, their little underdeveloped prefrontal cortex behind their forehead that won't fully mature until they're about 25 years old. That part of their brain is not able to kick in and say, hey, calm down, problem solve, think about it. You, as guardian or parent or caregiver or teacher, are usually going to be the one who is having to color in that information, just like you did with those babies, right? What are you feeling? What's happening? Oh, you need to use the bathroom? Are you hungry? What's going on? All of the questions that we ask ourselves when we are young, we need to keep asking ourselves as we get older. But we also need to help our children ask themselves these questions. Understand that when we go through humans, when I say we, I mean humans, as we go through traumatic things, it programs our brain. Some of us are more traumatized than others, so think about it as being on a dial. When we experience trauma, it causes our brain to learn and change and grow. And one of the changes that is even visible on brain scans is that the amygdala, the part of the brain that creates these really huge internal surges and urges that we experience as emotions and feelings transmitted as feelings throughout our body, that amygdala becomes hypertrophied because it's getting such a workout. Right? Every time we are going through these painful experiences, our brain is engaged in a learning process that makes these areas of the brain increase. And so that increases the reactivity of the child as they are reading the situations that they come into, and then causes them to react accordingly. This could be why, even though you may have a child who's been removed from a negative environment, that may not even remember some of the things that they were exposed to, that may still have certain behaviors that are difficult to understand, and the family can become frustrated, like, what, but we've done everything that we can do. Well, what we need to address is this here brain. So one of the things, and of course I can't address everything on one podcast, but I can give some tips and things that can help when you are thinking about what's happening with the tantrum, because a tantrum is a subjective label. I don't really even like that word because it has a negative connotation to it, where really, if I'm taking a done or descriptive, objective, non-judgmental, and effective view of what's happening with the child when they are in the midst of what we call a tantrum, I know that their amygdala is flaring. I know that what they're telling themselves or what they're thinking or what they believe is happening right now, and it's very real to them, it is causing big feelings. And so in that space, I also know that whatever this big thing is will pass. It's not causing harm to them to be in a state of sadness or tears or upsetness. However, it is something that I, as an adult, can help them learn how to address instead of telling them to not cry or to be quiet because it's irritating me. It's actually a more effective tool to sit with the child quietly and not engage them verbally, but to give them some time give them some space, give them some silence. This can also be, it's great if you've practiced mindfulness and meditation with them in calm times, because then you can engage them in something that's calming in real time, helping them breathe, helping them to deepen their breath, and even distraction. Distraction is a fair technique. One of the things that happens even in the most difficult of scenarios, that sometimes a humorous moment, or sometimes even cold ice. We have ice holding techniques. If you think that your youth, whatever level of development they are, that they can handle ice holding, then check out the ice holding skill that's on my YouTube channel that walks you through the process of holding something cold and giving your body a biological distraction so that the adrenaline can slow down, the other systems that have gotten worked up when we're in tantrum mode can be short circuited by the intense coldness, and focusing in mindfully on that. And also, it's important to understand that in the midst of a tantrum is not the time to try to teach a lesson. Getting into calm space and calm mind is the more important element. And sometimes that means that you have to separate from the conversation. I know as a parent, we can want to be making a point, and that doesn't help. It doesn't get in there when that little brain is riled up. So making sure that first we have had time to decompress, we have had moments to dry tears, and even given fair time to go in your room and have your cry or whatever you need to do to get it together, then come back and provide education, reflection, ask questions, and help that child put to words what they were having difficulty finding a way to say. And allowing them to do that without judgment and without shaming them. Because one of the more difficult elements of being a psychiatrist is to hear how the adults talk about emotions and talk about mental health is so very unhelpful to kids who are struggling with their emotions, because adults can be very invalidating to kids about their perspective, as if they have, because they're smaller, that they have a smaller experience. But what's actually happening in them is a bigger experience than what the adults are having, for lack of a better words. The next component is T, trouble. Again, how do you gentle parent when these kids don't gentle kid? Okay. But this really boils down to the concept of positive reinforcement. Just scientifically, all of the evidence says that it works better than negative reinforcement. What I mean by that is that we have a society where it is normal, it's encouraged to put your hands on your child, right? Okay. I've had many conversations with folks about spare the rod, spoil the child. And I do believe that sometimes you do have to help to physically guide them to a different space sometimes. However, once I understood that we all have this somatosensory cortex, this part of our brain that registers pain, and that we do not need to touch someone to slap them. We can slap people with words anytime we want. Many times we're doing it and we don't realize that we're doing it. So when we begin to think about how much we chastise, critique, comment negatively on our children, attempt to correct, attempt to prompt them into the space that we want them to be in, or shame them away from the spaces that we don't want them to be in, we engage in quite a bit of negative reinforcement. In fact, many people do not know how to parent in a way that is not punitive, because what they have experienced has often been probably an even more extreme version of punitive parenting. But it's important to understand that humans have these things called mirror neurons. Mirror neurons are deeply ingrained in multiple different areas of our cortex. And that means that they're in position to absorb from the sounds that we hear. They absorb information from the visuals that are around us. They absorb the customs, beliefs, and behaviors that are demonstrated in front of us. This is partially why when we say children do what I say, not what I do, that is a ineffective form of parenting, because as much as you tell them to do something else, if you are demonstrating a behavior in front of them, it is very likely that they're going to imitate that behavior elsewhere. And remember, it doesn't always have to be you. This is really important to do some self-evaluation and not only look at your own behaviors, but look at the behaviors of other parents or close role models, other adults or older siblings in their life. How do they talk? How do they speak to each other? What behaviors do you all engage in habitually that you may not even realize? How do you greet each other? How do you speak to each other? This requires real self examination because I can't tell you how many times I have sat in front of parents and they come in like, oh, my son is doing something. Oh, he bullying somebody. Oh, it's me and you when we get home. You know, dad is like, got his fist out like, hey, it's going down. And I'm like, okay, all right, okay. We got to talk about this. And unfortunately, there is so much violence in our general media, in our television, in our video games, in our children's programming, not just physical violence, but also verbal violence. If you listen to the cartoons, if you listen to most of the TV shows, and listen, I watch these TV shows with my kids just like the rest of us. And I'm also not saying that older shows were not verbally violent as well. They were even worse. Some of the things they could say back in the day are amazing. But it still boils down to um, being able to address the troubles that your kids are having with gentle parenting is really about strategizing a shift towards putting positive rewards into place that help redirect the behavior and shine the light on the behavior that you want. And this doesn't have to be about money. This doesn't really cost anything. It requires a shift in perspective. It requires a parent to be willing to verbally look for positive behaviors and reward them, notice them. When the kids are being quiet, thank them for being quiet versus yelling at them when they're loud. It makes a difference what we pay attention to and what we give rewards for. And validation or recognition, acknowledgement, being fully seen goes a very long way for all humans. Try it. It's delicious. Okay? So that is, I think, one of the key ways that you can start shifting into not necessarily gentle parenting, but parenting with an awareness that if we want to break certain cycles, we have to start with ourselves, because our children reflect our behaviors. But because of these mirror neurons, it comes out of them a little distorted. We don't always see it in them because their bodies are little or they exaggerate or it looks a little different than what you do, but you're in there. And it's important for you to reprogram yourself in order to help reprogram them. Lastly, I'm going to touch on trust issues. When it comes to trust, kids who have experienced ACEs, adverse childhood events, they have experienced psychological trauma, defined as experiences that are often experienced negatively that change the way you think about yourself, others, and the rest of the world. And the more of these that you have as a child, or the more that your environment is immersed in these, they have an additive effect to damage trust and make them operate more fearfully. Because, of course, they have experienced some very painful things. Sometimes the people who they are supposed to trust or who they believe they should be able to trust are the very ones doing them the damage. And so this gives a distorted perspective, and it's important for the people in their lives to recognize that when that young amygdala, well, first of all, let's think about our own amygdalas. Think about how many times when you're in intense emotions in a difficult conversation, in something heated, that you may say something that in the moment you might mean, but that when things calm down or they shift or they change, you're thinking about it completely differently. You sometimes you may not even remember you even said it like that, because that's definitely not what you meant. But the reality is that our amygdalas, they do us that way. They that part of our brain specializes in fear, and it specializes in distorting information and putting someone on the defensive, on the lookout, on the paranoid side. And so it actually takes time to learn how to get past those those fear challenges, that distrust. And consistency is the key. And what I mean by that is being very aware of the power of words. Because if you are a person who tosses around words, just know that traumatized brain is hearing an exaggerated version of the things that you're saying. And it's really important to recognize this, because their brains cannot erase when something is done. It's not how it works. You can't retract it. you can you can try to make up for it, but it is still highlighted by that reticular activating system that I talk about, that filter that puts them on that highest awareness. So when it comes to developing trust, that is something that requires you as the big person to have a great deal of patience. And that can be really difficult when you have a traumatized child. However, it can be very much worth it, because ultimately the goal is to get us all in a space where we can do a better job of empathizing with each other. Empathy is a powerful tool. It is a superpower. It's just is so important, and it's not taught to us in any school modality that we have had, and in fact it's been trained out of us. So I use the love skill to remind myself to use empathy. The L is listen and look with suspended judgment, recognizing that our perspective as the adult is different than that child's perspective. They don't have the skills we have. Their brain is not developed like ours is. And we have a hard time finding words sometimes. So it's even more difficult for them to express and process their emotions. Oh, observe the emotions in yourself and the other person. It is important for you as parent, caregiver, educator, or whoever you are, to recognize that you are having emotions in real time. Whatever their emotions are, it affects you. If a person in front of you is sad or hurting or angry or excited or pissed off, all of those things are contagious. It is something that we all share. So being able to put words to emotions is something that we are not good at, but it is so crucial. And it is important in empathy to identify emotions so that you all can both be on the same page. the validation. You do not have to agree with someone to validate them. Validation sounds like, man, that sucks. Man, I'm really sorry to hear that you experienced that. Wow, that's that's really difficult for me to process. I think I actually need a moment. I'm just going to sit with you in that space that you're in right now. That's validation. Not trying to change it, not trying to fix it, but just letting the person know that they're seen, they're heard, their experience is real. And that often will move them through that um, whatever situation that they're experiencing that you are attempting to help them through. Just those tools help you to do E, be more effective. Being skillful with the way that you engage with your traumatized child can help you to give them the skills that ultimately they will be able to carry forward in their lives. And so that they can help not only themselves, but also when their friends are having difficulties, as they will in life, or as they get older and they deal with relationships and they have to choose things in life. Us all becoming more skillful and effective is so crucial. So I invite you to join me for the next Trauma Cure. We are in the midst of our early bird special and it ends on January 9th. So I encourage you to go to thetraumacure.com/March, where you can get your early bird registration for the March 9th through 11th 3-day live virtual event where we will go deeper into these primitive brain systems and how trauma hurts and empathy heals. So I am excited to bring to you this episode of Minding Your Amygdala, a brain, body, and behavior podcast. I'm Dr. Lana, trauma psychiatrist, and I encourage you to use empathy every day to lead your way.